While the Third Reich crumbled amid ruins and fire, the men who had sustained the Nazi machinery faced their fates in vastly different settings, yet all under the same shadow of despair and mental chaos. In Berlin, beneath tons of concrete, Adolf Hitler spent his final days in the Führerbunker. There, amid delusions, hurriedly dictated testaments, and an impromptu marriage to Eva Braun, he decided to end his life before falling into enemy hands. At his side, Joseph Goebbels, the architect of propaganda, took fanaticism to its extreme. Together with his wife Magda, he also dragged their 6 children into a horrific end, convinced there was no future without Hitler. Hermann Göring, meanwhile, was reduced to a shadow of his former self. Stripped of power and accused of treason, he ended up as a prisoner of war, facing a trial that would mark him as one of the main culprits of the disaster. But if Göring had fallen into disgrace, Heinrich Himmler committed an even graver betrayal. The man Hitler had called "my loyal Heinrich" for years secretly sought to open negotiations with the Western Allies, dreaming of succeeding his leader. When his maneuver came to light, he was dismissed and condemned to absolute scorn. From then on, Himmler went from being the architect of Nazi terror to a fugitive hunted by both his own leader and the victors, trapped between betrayal and defeat. This documentary examines how, in the twilight of the Third Reich, the men who once dominated Europe were reduced to ashes. The Führerbunker, Hitler's last stronghold in a besieged Berlin. Since the 16th of January 1945, Adolf Hitler had made the Reich Chancellery bunker his final bastion. This underground shelter, protected by 8 meters of reinforced concrete, became the center from which the dictator witnessed the agony of his empire. As Berlin prepared for the war's final act, the Führer watched helplessly as defeat approached inexorably. The 20th of April, 1945, marked Hitler's 56th birthday. At 1 in the morning, his subordinates offered him formal congratulations, which he received with mechanical gestures and cold handshakes. He later retreated with Eva Braun and his secretaries, where the hours passed between political monologues and moments playing with Blondie, his German shepherd. Eva's jealousy over the attention given to the dog contrasted with the external reality. The rumble of artillery announced that the Red Army had reached Berlin's eastern suburbs. Simultaneously, American photographer Margaret Bourke-White was documenting in Leipzig the bodies of Nazi official Kurt Lissow and his family, who had chosen poison over Allied occupation. This epidemic of despair spread across the territory. In Bavarian villages, hundreds threw themselves into rivers. In Prussian cities, entire families chose to end their lives, driven by terror and the certainty that their world had come to an end. The tension escalated with each military report. Wilhelm Burgdorf reported that the Southern Front's defensive lines had collapsed and that the capital was nearly surrounded. Hitler, consumed by insomnia and dependent on medication, increasingly delayed his morning awakenings, as if he could postpone the catastrophic news. Meanwhile, the German High Command abandoned its headquarters in Zossen, aware that Soviet T-34 tanks were only a few kilometers away. In the afternoons, Hitler alternated between seclusion and brief appearances in the devastated Chancellery garden. There, with hands trembling from Parkinson's, he patted the cheeks of young Hitler Youth soldiers whom he would send against enemy tanks armed only with anti-tank grenades. He continued to insist that Berlin would resist to the last man, though his words no longer inspired confidence. Strategic meetings confirmed that the encirclement was tightening inexorably. Despite this, Hitler rejected any evacuation plans to the Alpine National Redoubt in Bavaria, declaring that his fate would be decided in the Reich's capital. The dawn of the 22nd of April brought the siege's most critical moment. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's troops broke into Niederschönhausen, less than 10 kilometers from the government center. At 9, the roar of artillery shells abruptly woke Hitler. That day, he issued a draconian decree. Anyone spreading defeatist rumors would be executed immediately, even if the orders seemed to come from Goebbels or the Führer himself. This provided the legal basis for summary executions in Berlin's streets. The midday meeting brutally revealed the disaster's magnitude. Reports lacked tactical coherence. Each commander fought their own isolated battle, with no possibility of coordinated resistance. Hitler completely lost emotional control, shouting that the war was lost and accusing his generals of treason. He proclaimed his irrevocable decision to stay in Berlin. His fury was fueled by news that the Steiner battle group had refused to launch the ordered counterattack, defying a direct order from the Führer for the first time. Joseph Goebbels arrived immediately after learning of the crisis. After a lengthy private conversation with Hitler, he emerged to publicly support the decision to remain in the besieged capital. As a demonstration of his commitment, he ordered his wife Magda to immediately bring their 6 children to the bunker. Martin Bormann, who was still preparing evacuation plans to the Alps, was paralyzed upon perceiving this definitive shift. Past 2 in the afternoon, Hitler reappeared calmer. For the first time, he admitted that the war was lost, but announced his intention to personally lead Berlin's final defense. The idea then emerged to regroup General Walter Wenck's 12th Army and direct it toward the capital. This proposal momentarily galvanized him, though militarily, those troops could barely hold their positions. At midnight on the 23rd of April, Wilhelm Keitel appeared at Wenck's command post with an urgent message from Hitler. The 12th Army was to break through to Theodor Buss's 9th Army and march together on Berlin. Keitel insisted that these maneuvers represented Germany's last hope. Wenck, however, had more pragmatic plans. Advance to Potsdam to relieve the encircled garrison and retreat toward the Elbe to make contact with the Americans. Theoretically, the 12th Army was a considerable force with 7 divisions and makeshift units of students and Hitler Youth members. The reality was devastating. A ghost army lacking transport, heavy artillery, and tanks, with only 80 operational armored vehicles. The next day at noon, weakened and sustained by Stumpfegger's injections, Hitler gathered the few collaborators left in the Chancellery. The half-empty room reflected the disintegration. Only Keitel, Jodl, Krebs, and Burgdorf remained at his side. Despite contradictory reports, he ordered an immediate counterattack. Arthur Axmann tried to convince him to flee, but Hitler rejected the idea coldly. Escaping, negotiating, or surrendering was unthinkable. The tension escalated further that night when a telegram from Göring burst in like a political bombshell. Invoking the decree naming him successor, he demanded to assume command and warned he would act independently if he received no response. Hitler, alongside Goebbels and Bormann, interpreted it as treason. The reaction was swift. He annulled the decree, dismissed Göring, and ordered his arrest in Obersalzberg. In those same days, another blow struck. British bombers devastated Berchtesgaden, reducing the Berghof to ruins. With it, the myth of the Alpine redoubt vanished. Goebbels proposed evacuation to the south, but Hitler dismissed it. He had no forces there to ensure his safety. Meanwhile, the capital was increasingly encircled. Tempelhof and Gartow had fallen, and Zhukov's and Konev's armies were joining west of the city. Unable to accept defeat, Hitler continued dictating impossible offensives. Weidling explained that they only controlled a perimeter of 6 to 8 kilometers around the Chancellery, but Hitler insisted that Steiner must attack from the north and Wenck from the south. On maps it sounded plausible. In reality it was a mirage. Meanwhile, Theodor Busse tried to break through to the west and ended up trapped in the Halbe massacre, a bloody battle in the forests south of Berlin where thousands of soldiers and civilians were surrounded by the Soviets. Further south, Walter Wenck barely advanced 20 kilometers, though Hitler turned this minimal movement into propaganda. Berlin radio portrayed it as if he were personally leading the defense against the Bolshevik assault. Amid this atmosphere of ruin, aviator Hanna Reich, the regime's celebrated test pilot, managed to land under fire near the Brandenburg Gate, Berlin's historic symbol. She was accompanied by the gravely wounded Robert Ritter von Greim, whom Hitler promoted to Field Marshal and named the last commander of the Luftwaffe, as if the Reich's Air Force could still function. The pressure didn't relent within the inner circle. Hermann Fegelein, Eva Braun's brother-in-law, called to urge her to flee with him, but she refused indignantly. When Hitler learned of this, he ordered Fegelein's capture. He was detained in an apartment on Kurfürstendamm, demoted and accused of desertion. At the same time, devastating news arrived. Mussolini had been captured and executed by partisans, confirming the collapse of fascism in Europe. Amid this desolation, a spark of hope emerged when Hans Krebs, chief of the Army General Staff, reported that Wenck had reached Fersch. Goebbels broadcast it on the radio, and Hitler, clinging to this illusion, gave Hanna Reich 2 cyanide vials. He confided that if everything failed, he and Eva would take their lives. Shortly after, he distributed capsules to his most loyal followers. With the dawn of the 28th of April, hope dissipated. Krebs relayed that Hitler had admitted that, without aid, all would be lost in 48 hours. Keitel confirmed the inevitable. Holster would not advance, and Steiner was still retreating. No viable plans remained. That same day, Soviet cannons unleashed relentless fire on central Berlin. The dust forced the bunker's ventilation to be shut off, and soon after came the confirmation that sealed their fate. The Ninth Army had failed to break through, was fighting in disarray, and was only trying to survive. The situation worsened when an employee reported that Stockholm radio announced Himmler had offered to surrender to the British. While lunching with Eva and his secretaries, Hitler heard the news. They discussed how to end their lives. Eva preferred poison, and he explained cyanide's effects before distributing more capsules. By afternoon, the collapse spread to Bavaria, where a rebel radio station proclaimed an anti-Nazi committee. Hitler ordered the movement crushed, while in Berlin, Keitel accused Heinrici of sabotage for withdrawing troops. That night, Heinrici was sacked. Soon after, Hitler asked Dönitz to confirm Himmler's betrayal. The Reichsführer denied it, but the BBC corroborated the report. Hitler erupted in fury. He declared Himmler a traitor, expelled him from the party, and ordered Greim and Reich to fly north so Dönitz could punish him. Fegelein met his end. He was shot for complicity. As night fell, Weidling warned that resistance would not last more than 2 days due to a lack of ammunition. Hitler listened in silence, refused to abandon the capital, and met with Goebbels and Bormann to decide final arrangements. The early hours of the 29th of April were marked by an unexpected turn. At 1 in the morning, after 13 years of their relationship, Hitler married Eva Braun in a brief ceremony held in the bunker, with Goebbels and Bormann as witnesses. Eva radiated satisfaction. She had achieved what she had sought for a decade. An hour later, Hitler dictated his political testament to Traudl Junge. He did so with a firm voice. He blamed Jews and the British for the disaster, thanked the German people, and reaffirmed his decision to resist. He dismissed Göring and Himmler, designated Dönitz as his successor, and added a private testament ordering that their bodies be incinerated immediately. When dawn broke on the 30th of April, the Soviets were already fighting in the vicinity of the Chancellery. Hitler rejected his pilot's escape proposals, insisting he must share Berlin's fate. At noon, he received news of the lynching of Mussolini and Clara Petacci in Milan and was shocked by the treatment of their bodies. He then reaffirmed the need for his own to be burned. That same day, communication with the outside world was reduced to the Navy's radio. Telephone lines were destroyed. Hitler made a brief visit to the makeshift hospital in the bunker, but stayed only a few seconds before withdrawing without a word. That night he poisoned his dog Blondie to test the cyanide's effectiveness. Weidling insisted that resistance would not last more than a day. Hitler remained inflexible. There would be no surrender. The atmosphere turned solemn. Hitler gave Magda Goebbels his gold insignia and listened, unyielding, to Goebbels' pleas to abandon the Chancellery. In the late afternoon, he walked the bunker's corridors for the last time, shook hands, raised his arm in a final salute, and retired with Eva Braun. Around 3:30 in the afternoon on the 30th of April, 1945, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun ended their lives. She took cyanide. He combined the poison with a gunshot to the temple. Thus ended the man who had promised a 1,000-year empire, and who, after 12 years of absolute power, watched his Third Reich collapse in Berlin's rubble. Cyanide at 10:44 p.m. How Göring evaded the gallows and chose his end. In the early months of 1945, reality hit Hermann Göring hard. The war was already decided. In the east, the Soviet army swept through Poland and advanced unchecked toward Berlin. In the west, American and British troops pushed through Germany. Cities were reduced to smoking ruins, and millions of civilians wandered aimlessly, in constant flight. In this scene of collapse, Göring's image was no longer that of the man who had embodied the regime's future for years. Once considered Hitler's natural heir, absolute leader of the Luftwaffe, and a symbol of power within the Third Reich, he now appeared weakened. The air force he commanded had crumbled, and his prestige was questioned amid accusations of inefficiency, personal ambitions, and detachment from military reality. Aware that the end was near on the 20th of April 1945, Hitler's birthday, Göring travelled to Berlin to present himself at the Reich Chancellery. That same day, he made a decision that encapsulated the end of an era. He ordered the demolition of Karenhall, his lavish residence, to prevent it from falling into Soviet hands. In that explosion, part of his private identity, built around the systematic looting of artworks he had greedily amassed over the years and sent to his Bavarian Alps hideouts, also vanished. Once in Obersalzberg, he finally understood what many suspected. Hitler had no intention of transferring power or seeking a political way out. He had decided to remain in the Berlin bunker until the end. Convinced he had to act, Göring sent a telegram invoking the 1941 succession decree that named him the legitimate heir should Hitler become incapacitated. However, the response was immediate and devastating. Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal secretary, convinced the Führer that the telegram was an attempted palace coup. Göring was stripped of all his positions, placed under SS surveillance, and became an irrelevant figure within the regime he had helped build. Soon after, Allied bombings destroyed Obersalzberg, and the Marshal fled to Austria with his family, still carrying uniforms, jewelry, and personal documents. Thus came the inevitable moment. On the 6th of May, 1945, during this journey to nowhere, he was intercepted by American troops. His first reaction was to present himself as a political interlocutor, with the air of superiority that had always accompanied him. But to the officers who detained him, he was merely a prisoner of war. His transfer to captivity was organized with extreme care. He first crossed Bavaria and was then taken to Luxembourg. There, in Mondorf-les-Bains, the elegant Hotel Palace had been converted into Camp Ashcan, a high-security internment center exclusively for surviving Nazi leaders. That former spa, once a symbol of leisure, was now surrounded by barbed wire, watchtowers, and armed patrols. From his arrival, Göring stood out among the other regime leaders. While many prisoners arrived dejected or disoriented, he maintained his composure. An impeccable uniform, medals on his chest, and a demeanor that sought to convey aristocratic dignity. His attitude did not go unnoticed by the guards, who still perceived him as a figure of authority even in defeat. However, a key detail soon emerged: his morphine addiction. For years, he had consumed daily doses, and at the time of his capture, he carried a considerable number of capsules. Military doctors subjected him to a strict detoxification program, with a gradual reduction of the drug, a controlled diet, and constant checkups. Within weeks, his body underwent a remarkable transformation. He lost more than 25 kilograms, regained mobility, and displayed unexpected vitality for someone who seemed destined for physical decline. Concurrently, interrogations began immediately. Unlike other detainees, Göring responded with precision, spoke confidently, and demonstrated a detailed memory of the regime's organization, his relationship with Hitler, and the Luftwaffe's situation. He tried to portray himself as a pragmatic politician, someone who had sought to preserve Germany amid the chaos, rather than as directly responsible for crimes. In this tone, he justified military and political decisions, casting himself as a moderating force against what he considered the excesses of others. To the American officers, it was clear they were dealing with a man who still tried to influence his surroundings through language and rhetoric. During the summer of 1945, military psychologists evaluated the prisoners. The results were surprising. Göring scored an intelligence quotient of 138, the highest among all the defendants to be tried. Reports described him as charismatic, dominant, and highly manipulative. This reinforced the notion that he would be the central figure in the upcoming trials. The Americans then tightened security measures, convinced he had to reach Nuremberg alive. Taking advantage of this waiting period, Göring rehearsed his defense. In conversations with officers, he tried to distance himself from the most heinous crimes, directly blaming Himmler and the SS for the exterminations and mass executions. He presented himself as a military and diplomatic leader, someone who sought to negotiate rather than destroy. However, documents signed by him and accumulated evidence placed him at the core of criminal decisions. In September 1945, after months of evaluations and interrogations, he was transferred to Nuremberg. For the Allies, he was prisoner number 1, Hitler's heir now transformed into a symbol of international justice. On the 20th of November 1945, the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg was inaugurated, with judges and prosecutors from the victorious powers. Hermann Göring was the highest-ranking defendant after Karl Dönitz, the last Reich president appointed by Hitler, and faced charges of conspiracy, waging aggressive war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The accusations included planning military invasions, indiscriminate attacks on civilians, systematic looting of cultural assets, and participation in the administrative machinery that enabled political persecution and genocide. He was held directly responsible for the disappearance of opponents under the Nacht und Nebel decree, the torture of prisoners of war, and the murder and enslavement of millions of civilians, including the extermination of an estimated 5,700,000 Jews. When called to enter a plea, Göring attempted to read a political statement. The tribunal's president, Sir Geoffrey Lawrence, a British judge known for his sternness and meticulousness, firmly interrupted him and demanded he limit himself to responding. Göring declared himself not guilty in the sense of the indictment, and from that moment he turned the trial into a stage where he sought to present himself as the last leader of the Reich. Over the 218 days of the trial, which extended until September 1946, the prosecution presented damning evidence, from the order signed in July 1941 delegating the Jewish question to Reinhard Heydrich, head of the Reich Security Main Office, to documents and records implicating him in pogroms like Kristallnacht and the confiscation of Jewish property. The defense, meanwhile, tried to soften his image. Witnesses like Erhard Milch, Luftwaffe Field Marshal, described him as a moderate man who could not oppose Hitler without condemning himself and his family. Göring himself insisted he had never known what was happening in the concentration camps, which were under Heinrich Himmler's SS control, and that his role had been that of a diplomat trying to prevent war. This strategy repeatedly collapsed when prosecutors presented documents signed by him or linked him to specific decisions, such as the execution of the 50 British airmen recaptured after escaping from Stalag Luft, 3, or the extermination of Hungarian Jews. During the sessions, Göring maintained a defiant attitude. He gestured, shook his head, laughed softly, took notes, and whispered with other defendants. He even tried to establish himself as the group's leader until the authorities decided to isolate him to prevent him from influencing his peers. To the American psychiatrist Leon Goldensohn, tasked with evaluating the prisoners, he confessed that the tribunal was foolish for judging lesser figures like Walter Funk, Reich Minister of Economics, or Ernst Kaltenbrunner, head of the Reich Security Main Office after Heydrich, instead of letting him take all the blame. The most tense moment came in April 1946, when the interrogation led by Robert H. Jackson, the American chief prosecutor and Supreme Court justice, became one of the most memorable episodes of the trial. Göring displayed agility and composure, responding with a combative tone that impressed the press, but he could not maintain that image in the face of film evidence from the concentration camps or the records placing him at the center of looting and persecution. When the tribunal concluded the trial on the 30th of September 1946, the verdict was unequivocal: guilty on all charges. On the 1st of October, the maximum sentence was pronounced: death by hanging. Once convicted and confined in Nuremberg prison, his life was subject to constant surveillance. 2 guards remained with him at all times, the cell lights were never turned off, and every visit was strictly controlled. Within that oppressive routine, he took refuge in writing and in conversations with his guards, whom he continued to treat as subordinates. As the execution date approached, the proximity of the event led to tightened control measures. The gallows were prepared, the executioner was ready, and the international press had been summoned to witness the outcome. Göring was to be the first to ascend the gallows, a symbolic gesture with which the Allies sought to emphasize that the main defendant would receive the same punishment as the others. In his final days, he received visits from the American pastor Henry Göring, who noted that Göring preferred to discuss politics and history rather than spirituality. His attitude contrasted with that of other prisoners who sought religious reconciliation. Albert Speer, a fellow inmate, would later recall that Göring continued to behave as a leader, dominating conversations and trying to bolster the morale of the condemned. Then came the night of the 15th of October 1946, when the surveillance seemed impenetrable, yet he managed to carry out his plan. At 10:44 in the evening, the guards heard a sharp noise in his cell. Upon entering, they found him convulsing, with the pungent smell of cyanide permeating the air. The American coroner Charles P. Larson certified his death 1 minute later. Göring had outwitted his guards to avoid the gallows and choose his own end. The dual face of Himmler, executioner of the Reich and false humanitarian. Amid the Nazi collapse, Heinrich Himmler, the man Hitler had called "my loyal Heinrich" for years, began to act on his own. Until then, he had been the head of the SS, responsible for the Gestapo, the concentration camps, and the extermination apparatus. But with the regime in ruins, he sought a personal way out. As early as late March, he had attempted to establish discreet contacts with the Western Allies. His fear was clear: falling prisoner to the Soviets and facing Stalin's judgment. To this end, he turned to Count Folke Bernadotte, a representative of the Swedish Red Cross. In northern Germany, he held several meetings with him, making it clear that Hitler was finished. He offered himself as a guarantor of surrender, provided he was recognized as successor. With the same goal, he promoted the well-known White Buses operation, which evacuated thousands of prisoners to Sweden. This was a political maneuver, a humanitarian gesture to present himself as a leader capable of negotiation. On the 23rd of April in the city of Lübeck, Himmler formally declared to Bernadotte his willingness to surrender to the British and Americans, excluding the Soviets. The information spread quickly, and on the 28th of April, the BBC publicly broadcast his offer. In the Berlin bunker, Hitler heard the report on the radio. His reaction was immediate and furious. He felt betrayed by the man he had considered his most loyal servant. The next day, the 29th of April, he drafted his political testament. In that document, he expelled both Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler from the National Socialist Party and stripped them of all their positions. He named Karl Dönitz as his successor, closing off any prospect of power for Himmler. Within hours, the man who had been at the pinnacle of the Nazi apparatus was stripped of authority and branded a traitor. The consequences were swift. In Flensburg, where Dönitz was attempting to organize a final government, Himmler appeared hoping to secure a position in the new administration. He was received coldly and soon made to understand that there was no place for him. From that moment, he was reduced to a political outcast, forced to go into hiding and begin his flight. From the moment he began his escape under the false identity of a simple private sergeant, Heinrich Himmler's life was reduced to an erratic journey through a ruined country. It was May 1945, and the former head of the SS wandered through northern Germany without a clear destination, accompanied only by a small group of still loyal collaborators. Among them were his personal aide, Werner Grothmann, and a few officers from his inner circle. All shared the same fate: fugitives seeking to evade Allied surveillance. The disguise he chose was no accident. He presented himself as a member of the Feldgendarmerie, the German army's military police, which provided a plausible cover at roadblocks. He carried false documents identifying him as Heinrich Hitzinger and wore an ordinary field uniform, far different from those that had distinguished him during his years of power. With a grown beard and simple glasses, he sought to blend in with the crowd of defeated soldiers roaming the roads. The rank of sergeant allowed him to maintain a low profile, not high enough to draw attention, nor so low as to arouse suspicion. The group had scarcely any resources of their own. They advanced on foot most of the time, with occasional rides in abandoned vehicles. They slept in stables, ruined houses, or under makeshift shelters that barely protected them from the elements. Their steps took them through the fields of Lower Saxony and Schleswig-Holstein, always avoiding the main roads where the British had set up checkpoints. The landscape they traversed was that of a defeated country. Each day, entire columns of soldiers surrendered, while waves of refugees fled the Soviet advance. In the villages, the same scenes repeated: hunger, exhaustion, uprooted families, and disarmed fighters mingled in a shared tableau of desolation. The infrastructure was collapsed, bridges destroyed, railway lines rendered useless, and roads clogged with displaced people. Amid this chaos, Himmler found a certain protection in anonymity, though each day heightened the uncertainty. British checkpoints posed a constant danger. There, he had to present his false papers and answer as little as possible to avoid arousing suspicion. His unkempt beard and glasses gave him a different appearance, but his face remained a risk. At every inspection, the tension was absolute. A single recognition could unravel his disguise. For this reason, he always carried a cyanide capsule hidden in his mouth. It was his last resort, the guarantee that he would never fall into enemy hands alive. Between the 10th and 20th of May, the group moved northwest, first toward Bremen and then Hamburg. Their final objective was to reach Flensburg, where Karl Dönitz's provisional government was still under British occupation. There, Himmler hoped to find some political foothold to regain a place in the new power structure. On the 21st of May, 1945, Heinrich Himmler arrived disguised and under a false name in the town of Bremerwörde, located between Hamburg and Bremerhaven. In those days, the city was a transit point under strict British control. Refugees, disarmed German units, and a steady stream of prisoners of war passed through. The Allies maintained rigorous surveillance. Military intelligence had already warned that even prominent figures might attempt to escape disguised as ordinary soldiers. When Himmler's small group presented itself at a checkpoint of the British Army's 30th Corps, the procedure followed the usual routine. Prisoners were lined up, documents checked, and brief interrogations conducted. At first glance, the papers of the supposed Sergeant Hitzinger appeared in order. However, a British soldier noticed something odd in his behavior. Unlike other surrendered men, this man maintained an unusual rigidity and responded in a detached tone. The impression was enough to raise suspicions. The officers decided to separate the group and examine them more closely. Himmler, increasingly tense, repeated brief responses as if reciting a memorized script. His companions, including Werner Grothmann, upheld the same story, though with little conviction. Their coordination seemed rehearsed, which heightened British distrust. His face, despite the beard and glasses, seemed familiar to those who had seen photographs of Nazi leaders. A search of their meager belongings revealed items that raised further alarms: a knife bearing SS symbols and documents inconsistent with the rank of an ordinary non-commissioned officer. These findings were enough to order their immediate transfer to Westertimke, a British prisoner centre for more thorough identity checks. According to reports, Himmler offered no physical resistance. Still, he clung stubbornly to his false identity. His insistence, coupled with the evident anxiety in his every gesture and the way he constantly scanned his surroundings, confirmed he knew the ruse was on the verge of collapsing. Grothmann, younger and less recognizable, remained silent, reinforcing the shaky alibi of the false documents. After the initial interrogation, the group was taken to a temporary detention room. There, a more thorough body search was conducted. The officers remarked among themselves that the detainee had a distinctive voice and unmistakable hands. What stood out most was the shape of his jaw and mouth, features that matched descriptions circulated by Allied intelligence. Confirmation seemed increasingly imminent. Superiors were immediately informed, and the prisoner's transfer to Nuremberg was ordered, where a center specialized in identifying high-ranking Nazis operated. For this reason, at dawn on the 22nd of May, Himmler's transfer to Nuremberg, southeast of Hamburg, began. There, the British Army had established a center dedicated to interrogating prisoners deemed of high value. This journey marked the definitive shift from anonymous fugitive to suspect under direct scrutiny. The officers tasked with escorting him were not unaware of the doubts surrounding his true identity. The discovery of incriminating items, combined with his detached demeanor and physical traits, fueled the conviction that he was someone of significance within the defeated regime. Security was tightened. Several armed soldiers surrounded him at all times, isolated from other prisoners, with clear orders to prevent any escape attempt. The journey unfolded in a collapsed country. The roads, still half destroyed, were crowded with refugees, Allied convoys, and German prisoners in transit. Amid this multitude, the vehicle carrying him moved with priority. Himmler maintained a rigid silence, limiting himself to minimal responses. The British noted that his restraint reinforced the impression that he was not an ordinary soldier, but someone fully aware that revealing his name would mean the end. Before reaching Nuremberg, the convoy stopped in Uelzen, where a temporary prisoner sorting center was in operation. There he spent a few hours in a separate cell, subjected to a new search. The items found were packed and sent to superiors, while efforts were made to keep him isolated to prevent rumors or premature recognition. After this brief procedure, the journey continued to its final destination. In the late afternoon, the group arrived in Nuremberg. British forces had established their interrogation center at the residence of Major General Thomas Morar Hutton, converted into a temporary barracks. Himmler and his companions were taken directly to guarded facilities. Although he was still listed in documents as Hitzinger, doubts about his identity were now almost certainties. The immediate decision was to isolate him even from his own associates. He was led to a solitary cell with armed guards at the door and subjected to a thorough search to rule out poison capsules or hidden objects. During this examination, key details were confirmed. The shape of his jaw, a scar on his lip, and the appearance of his hands matched known descriptions of the SS chief. Nevertheless, he insisted on maintaining his story of being a low-ranking sergeant. The night of the 22nd of May passed under constant surveillance. British reports describe a prisoner who barely spoke, appearing restless, biting his lips and rubbing his hands. He was not allowed to write or receive papers, and his movements were meticulously controlled. Meanwhile, officers gathered photographs and descriptions to proceed with formal verification. The procedure began with a full body search. Under the supervision of Captain C.J. Wells, a British military doctor, he was ordered to partially remove his clothing. The inspection confirmed suspicions. The prominent lower jaw matched photographic records. The scar on the lip corresponded to old descriptions, and a dental irregularity further reinforced the identification. When Wells asked him to open his mouth for a more thorough examination, the prisoner showed resistance. He moved his tongue insistently, as if trying to conceal something. Suspicion arose immediately. Finally, under pressure, he opened his mouth, and the doctor detected a small glint of glass, a cyanide capsule hidden between his teeth. Wells attempted to remove it, but Himmler reacted abruptly, biting down hard on it. The sound of shattering glass echoed in the room. Within seconds, the poison began to take effect. Himmler collapsed to the floor in convulsions, his skin turning bluish, his breathing labored, his eyes wide open. Officers tried to restrain him while Wells performed emergency maneuvers, but the cyanide acted swiftly, blocking oxygen absorption in his cells. In less than 15 minutes, he was dead. The clock showed nearly 11 at night when his death was officially certified. In the very space where confessions were expected, Now lay the body of the man who had directed the Nazi machinery of repression and extermination for years. The British reaction was one of surprise and frustration. They had confirmed Heinrich Himmler's identity, but his death had forever closed the possibility of interrogating him. The final performance, Goebbels and the twilight of the Third Reich. Unconditional loyalty to the Führer had defined every aspect of Joseph Goebbels' existence. During the first months of 1945, this fidelity took on an increasingly sinister tone. His public speeches and newspaper articles became steeped in fatalism, as if he sought to psychologically prepare the German population for an inevitable end. The Reich's capital was practically defenseless. Fortifications were scarce, artillery insufficient, and the improvised Volkssturm units were being decimated. On the 21st of January, Goebbels noted in his diary the mass flight of millions toward the west, a testament to the Reich's moral and material collapse. In private conversations, he cautiously suggested to Hitler the possibility of exploring an understanding with the Western Allies, though the leader's categorical rejection silenced the propaganda minister, who feared jeopardizing the carefully cultivated trust. Together with Magda, he even discussed the topic of suicide and the fate of their children, a reflection that revealed they both already saw the end as inevitable. By April, the situation grew even more critical. On the 12th of April, the news of Franklin D. Roosevelt's death was interpreted by Goebbels as a providential sign, an event he used to bolster Hitler's spirits, though reality offered no grounds for hope. Days later, on the night of the 18th of April, he proceeded to destroy personal documents, erasing traces of his private life and, possibly, his guilt. Meanwhile, the Nazi hierarchy began to disintegrate. Göring had lost all influence, Himmler was discredited after his failure in command at the front, and the closest collaborators were preparing to abandon the capital. On the 20th of April, during Hitler's birthday, many of them visited him for the last time before departing. On the 22nd of April, Hitler announced his decision to remain in Berlin until the end, and Goebbels resolved to stand by him without hesitation. For him, the capital had to become the final bastion, even if it meant total ruin. He abandoned his residence in Schwanenwerder with Magda and their 6 children, followed by escorts and vehicles loaded with luggage. As night fell, they descended into the underground shelter of the Reich Chancellery. That same day, Goebbels declared to Vice Admiral Hans Erich Voss that neither surrender nor flight were options he was willing to consider. On the 23rd of April, he issued a message to the inhabitants of Berlin. He urged them to resist with everything they had, appealing to the memory of their parents and the future of their children, and emphasized that he, along with his wife and their little ones, would share the same fate as the people. In this way, he sought to inspire a desperate defense, presenting the battle not as an isolated episode, but as an exemplary sacrifice for all of Germany. Once settled in the bunker, his presence became immediate and constant. He participated in meetings, relayed reports on the city's situation, and continued drafting radio communiques, though hardly anyone listened to them anymore. At the same time, he tried to bolster Hitler with words of encouragement, maintaining an energetic tone while other collaborators showed doubts or exhaustion. Goebbels was not acting with a practical purpose. He portrayed himself as the Führer's indispensable companion in the final act. Magda, for her part, tended to the children. She settled them in cramped rooms, placed toys on their beds, and tried to provide some semblance of routine. Helga, the eldest, sensed the confinement with unease, while the younger ones played in the corridors or followed Blondie, Hitler's dog, oblivious to the magnitude of events. Some officers tried to persuade Magda to take the children out of there, but she rejected all proposals, backed by Joseph. The family had to remain united as a symbol of absolute loyalty. The early morning of the 29th of April was marked by an extraordinary episode inside the Führerbunker. As fighting echoed close by, Hitler married Eva Braun in a discreet civil ceremony held in a narrow corridor. Goebbels witnessed it with solemnity, and Magda later described it as more of a funeral ritual than a festive union. The ceremony was followed by a simple, almost symbolic breakfast attended by the couple's closest associates, a gesture that confirmed to all that the Führer had chosen his end. Shortly afterward, Hitler retreated with his secretary Traudl Junge to dictate his political testament. Goebbels and Martin Bormann were present as witnesses, signing a document that did not ensure continuity, but revealed the regime's twilight. In those pages, Hitler fragmented the succession. Karl Dönitz was appointed president in Flensburg, Bormann took control of the party, and Goebbels was named Reich Chancellor. The propaganda minister received the title without surprise, aware that it held no real power and served only as a farewell gesture. Nevertheless, Goebbels added a personal statement in which he acknowledged that for the first time in his life he was disobeying a direct order from Hitler. He would not leave Berlin. He justified this decision in the name of loyalty and a sense of humanity that compelled him to stay in the capital, ready to share its fate until the end. This resolve extended to his family. Magda and the children would not be evacuated, as they were to join him in what he conceived as the ultimate act of absolute loyalty. On the 30th of April, the bunker's tense calm shattered with the news that Hitler had shot himself in his private quarters. Otto Günsche relayed the news, and Goebbels received it with somber serenity, murmuring that with the Führer's death, Germany too had died. His despair was immediate. In a low voice he remarked that he would go out to the Chancellery garden to let himself be caught by Soviet fire, convinced that such a death at the enemy's hands would symbolically seal the fate of all they had defended. Vice Admiral Hans-Erich Voss would later recall those words, which revealed both the desolation and the stubborn loyalty of the propaganda minister. He admitted that all was lost and that the only path left was to follow his leader's example. While some officers sought ways to negotiate with the Soviets, Joseph and Magda reinforced their decision to remain in the bunker. She was resolute. She could not envision a future for her children in a world without Hitler. That night, she gathered with them in their rooms, read them stories, and tried to maintain their routine, while Joseph paced the corridors, bidding farewell with a solemn gesture. The day ended with the bodies of Hitler and Eva Braun reduced to ashes in the garden, confirming that there was no turning back. After that cremation, Magda carried out the resolution she had silently harbored. She summoned the SS dentist Helmut Kuntz and ordered him to administer morphine to each child. One by one they received the dose, believing it was medicine. Helga, the eldest, grew suspicious and asked why it was necessary, but her mother held her in silence until, crying, she succumbed to sleep. With the 6 children deeply sedated, the doctor Ludwig Stumpfegger administered cyanide capsules. Within seconds they stopped breathing. Nurse Erna Flegel would later testify that Magda participated with a calm that struck everyone as chillingly inhuman. Joseph, in another room, was fully aware of what was happening. For many, that scene represented the lowest point of the entire catastrophe. The collapse of the Reich also claimed the lives of 6 children. During the early hours of the 1st of May, the Goebbels were alone in their quarters. The death of their children had sealed their fate. Magda spent the early morning motionless, barely speaking a word, while Joseph paced the corridors nervously, unable to stay still. In the early hours of the 1st of May, Goebbels sent General Hans Krebs to negotiate with the Soviets. The emissary was received by Marshal Vasily Chuikov at a school in Tempelhof, used as the command post for the 8th Guards Army. Krebs arrived accompanied by an interpreter, carrying dust-stained maps from the bunker, but he lacked written authority to sign a surrender. He verbally explained that Hitler had died and sought a temporary ceasefire to discuss terms with the new German leaders. Chuikov listened to the proposal and immediately responded that no partial agreement was possible. He would accept only the unconditional surrender of all Berlin forces. The meeting dragged on until dawn with no progress, and around 6 in the morning, Krebs returned to the Chancellery with confirmation that no truce was possible. Upon hearing the refusal, Goebbels coldly declared that it was all over. Goebbels still fulfilled his official role. He dictated and broadcast the Reich's final communiqué by radio, announcing Adolf Hitler's death and stating that command had passed to Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz. In the message, he urged continued resistance against Bolshevism, though Berlin no longer had the means to fight. It was the last time the regime's voice addressed the German people, a propagandistic echo that contrasted with the absolute collapse unfolding beneath the Chancellery. During the final hours of the 1st of May, Joseph and Magda Goebbels bid farewell to the few close associates still remaining in the bunker. Hans Erich Voss recalled that Joseph took him by the arm and said a captain could not abandon his sinking ship. He bluntly acknowledged that the children were no longer alive and that their fate was decided. Meanwhile, Magda wrote her final letters, including one to Harold Quandt, her eldest son, in which she justified what had happened as an act of loyalty she considered the only possible way out. Around 8:30 in the evening, the couple left the bunker and walked to the Chancellery garden, the same place where Hitler had been buried hours earlier. Accounts of what happened vary. Some claim both bit into cyanide capsules and received an immediate gunshot as a coup de grace. Others, like Günther Schwegemann, state that the Goebbels descended the stairs in front of him, and shortly after he heard the shots that confirmed the outcome. When he went outside, he found their bodies lifeless. Following Joseph's instructions, Schwegemann ordered an SS soldier to fire several shots at the corpse to ensure death. Then, the bodies were dragged to a prepared area, doused with fuel, and set ablaze. The flames, however, did not fully consume them, and the remains were only partially charred amid the ruins. There was no burial. Days later, when Soviet control over Berlin was complete, the charred remains were shown to Vice Admiral Voss, who confirmed they belonged to the Goebbels.